Hello everyone, welcome to today's class. The topic of today's class is common pool resources. So before we begin with the lecture in greater detail, let us focus on the brief outline of today's class so that you have an idea that what is going to come up. First, I am going to introduce certain concepts which will be very useful to understand today's lecture. Secondly, I am going to discuss how can we understand common pool resources or how do we define common pool resources, right? Thirdly, I am going to give you the understanding of how common pool resources are very important or very significant for economic development. And lastly, I am going to introduce some concepts or some context from Indian economy. So you have an idea about how common pool resources are being used in Indian economy. Okay, so what are the learning outcomes in today's lecture? So once you are done with the lecture, you can expect following outcomes. So you will definitely have an idea of common pool resources. Secondly, you will be able to understand that common pool resources and its importance in case of economic development. And you will develop an idea regarding the Indian context. So these are the couple of lecture outcomes you are going to expect once you are done with the lecture. Moving on, let me introduce a couple of concepts here. At this point of time, I'm going to introduce a concept called excludability. What is excludability? A legal concept that when enforced allows an owner to prevent others from using his or her asset. What do we understand by that? I'm going to illustrate within a moment. What are excludable resources? So one whose ownership allows the owner to use it while simultaneously denying other the privilege. Suppose you have some kind of resources and it just belongs to you, and you are not allowing anybody to use that kind of resources. So basically what are you doing? You are basically excluding anyone to use the resources. It belongs to you, right? So that's how we understand the concept of excludability. Moving on, the next concept called rivalrous or rival. I'm sure you have heard the term called rival. What do you understand by that? Consumption by one consumer prevents simultaneous consumption by the other consumers. Or alternatively, consumption by one party reduces the ability of the other party to consume it. Suppose you are consuming one good. Since you are consuming it, so it may not be possible for other people to consume the similar good at same point of time. That's why simultaneously that word is very important. Why? Because at a time, the similar good cannot be consumed by two parties or two consumers at a time, right? So that's what we call rivalrous or rival. Then we also have another concept called non-rival goods or services. Are there any kind of good which is non-rival, or are there any kind of services which are non-rival? Just try to think about it. So what is that concept? That concept is consumption by one person has an insignificant impact on the quality and quantity of the good or service available for another person to use. Unlike rivalry, here in this particular case, or there are various types of resources or goods that can be consumed simultaneously. Right? So maybe there are 5 people or more than 5 people who can actually consume simultaneously one goods or any kind of resources. Right? So 3 concepts we actually have learned so far. One is excludability. Second one is rivalry or rivalness. And the third one is non-rival. Okay? Now, the question is, by using all 3 concepts, can we really categorize the available goods or resources which we actually have or we actually use in our day-to-day life? I'm sure once you are hearing this concept or once you are hearing the word itself, I'm sure you can come up with various types of example. So can we categorize those goods? Are there any categories where we can put these goods in which follow these types of concepts? So at this point, I would ask you to take a pause and look around and try to think what are the goods which actually follow this kind of characteristics. And then I'll give you the definition of those categories. Okay, so two concepts we learned, rivalry and excludability, right? Now the question I asked that whether we can categorize any goods or services by using or by taking into account these two characteristics. Yes, we can. So there are 4 types of goods actually if you are trying to categorize all the goods and services based on these 2 criteria. So first let me tell you what is private good. Private goods are products that are excludable and rival. They have to be purchased before they can be consumed. Thus, anyone who cannot afford private good is excluded from their consumption. Likewise, the consumption of private goods by an individual prevents other individuals from consuming the same goods. Therefore, private goods are also considered rival goods. What are the examples? Okay, mobile phone, your car, or maybe the clothing or shoes you are wearing, then ice cream, anything. Now, let me illustrate with one example. Let's say the mobile phone, maybe by using which you are actually listening to this lecture. So, you actually bought this mobile phone, right? So, you had to pay for that mobile phone. Okay? So, not everyone can use your mobile phone. Before that, if you had to use a mobile phone, you had to purchase it. You had to pay for it. So that's how it is excludable. Since you paid, so you excluded all other people from using that mobile phone. Secondly, it is rival. How it is rival? Since you are using that mobile phone, are you allowing your friends to use it? No. It's you who is maybe watching this lecture or maybe talking to someone. It is not the case that you and your friend is using the mobile phone simultaneously. It's just not possible, right? So you can think of various examples which is actually having this kind of characteristics, that is excludable as well as rival. Clear? So if a good or if a resource is having these characteristics, these 2 characteristics, then we call them as private goods. Next, public good. Public goods describe products that are non-excludable and non-rival. That means no one can be prevented from consuming them. An individual can use them without reducing their availability to other individuals. Examples. What are the examples? Street light, public addressing system, etc. Now think about this street light. So once there are a lot of street lights, it's actually giving lights to everyone. Let's say suppose in your neighborhood, I'm sure in your neighborhood you must have some kind of street light. So since there is a street light, so the entire neighborhood is getting the light from that street light, right? It is not the case that you are getting some amount of light and some person is getting, or your neighbor is getting some amount of light. It is just not possible. So that's why it's not excludable. So you cannot exclude anyone if there is a light or if there is a street light on your locality, right? And also it is non-rival. So each and everyone in the neighborhood are getting the light simultaneously. It is not the case that from 7 to 8 your place is getting lit and or 8 to 10 someone else's place is getting lit. No, it is just not that's not possible. So that is why the characteristics of non-excludable and non-rival are, we are getting these 2 characteristics in case of public good. Moving on. There are also one thing called club goods. Club goods are products that are excludable but non-rival. Thus, individuals can be prevented from consuming them, but their consumption does not reduce their availability to other individuals, at least until a point of overuse or congestion is reached. Club goods are sometimes also referred to as artificially scarce resources. Then, which 2 characteristics we are getting for club goods? They are non-rival but excludable. What are the examples? Let's say cinema. If you are going to watch a movie at a movie theater, what is the first step you have to do? You have to buy a ticket, right? So not everyone can get the access to a cinema hall. For that access, you have to pay some money. So that is why you are excluding people. People who can't afford to buy a cinema hall ticket, they can go to the cinema hall. But, so that's how it is excludable, right? But Once you are entering into the movie theater, let's say you are watching Bahubali. So once you're entering into the movie theater and the Bahubali started, so everyone is watching it simultaneously, right? It is not the case that the front row people are watching Bahubali and the last row people, they are not able to watch it. It is just not the case, right? So it is excludable but non-rival. Okay, so we are calling them as club goods. Moving on. So now we are moving on to the last one, that is called common resources, and this is also our today's main focus would be on this. So common resources are defined as products or resources that are non-excludable but rival. That means virtually anyone can use them. However, if one individual consumes common resources, their availability to other individual is reduced. The combination of these two characteristics often results in an overuse of common resources. So this last point, that is overuse of common resources, I'm going to focus on this last point in a greater detail in the later part of the lecture. But the point is, the two characteristics, if you're focusing on the two characteristics, that is excludable and rival. So in this case particular, this common property resources or common pool resources, we are saying it does not follow the excludability. So you cannot exclude anyone to use it, but it is rival in nature. For example, let's say ocean fishery, or maybe grazing land, or maybe village pond. So can you really exclude anyone? The village pond which is owned by everyone of this village, can you exclude everyone? No, you can't, right? So, but you cannot exclude, that is true. But the point is, if you are allowing everyone to take the water, or let's say if you're allowing everyone to use the ocean for fishing, then it might happen over the time that fish stock is going down. So that's how it is rival, right? So two characteristics we have already observed. One is excludable, or rather non-excludable, particularly for common pool resources, but rival. Now I would just try to give you the summary based on these two particular characteristics. So rival excludable, private goods; rival non-excludable, common resources; non-rival excludable, club goods; and non-rival non-excludable, public goods. So just try to remember, if you have to have some idea of common resources, you also have to have the idea how to distinguish between the other types of resources, okay? So common resources, which is the focus or main focus of today's lecture, is rival and non-excludable in nature. Now, the next question we are going to move on from this point, that is, what are the significance of common pool resources? So we have defined the common pool resources, but what is the importance of common pool resources? Okay, so the question I asked, that what are the significance of these common pool resources, right? So to answer this question, just here I would like you to recapitulate from the previous lectures of ours where we have discussed about renewable resources. Can you find the similarity between these renewable resources and common pool resources? Mostly, the type of example we have taken so far, and from the previous lecture, we can see most of the common pool resources are type of renewable resources only, right? So this exercise actually would help you to connect back with the previous lecture as well. So and the knowledge you have gained from the previous lectures. Okay, so these types of resources, especially fisheries, forests, these are all renewable resources because they can regenerate through a natural process. Okay, now here I'm going to give you some graphs just to give you the idea of this common pool resources. Okay, here in the particular example, I'm giving you the land use over the long term, and as you can see, the timeline is quite big, right? It's from 0 to 2016. The particular example or the particular place I would like you to focus is the grazing. As you can see, that green marked area, that's the grazing part, it's actually on rise. It's been increasing since from the beginning till 2016, the data is till 2016, so it's increasing. And we know grazing is type of a common pool resources where actually animals do go to eat their food, for instance, the grass, right? Now, in this particular graph, we are showing the grazing land use over the long term. This is from 1600 to 2016, and it is region-wise, country-wise, okay? You can figure out India in this particular graph, and you can see Africa is having the high amount of grazing land, and it's on rise. Even for India and China also, these two countries also are having very high amount of grazing land, and it has increased over the time. This particular graph gives you an idea of share of land used for permanent meadows and pastures. This is particularly for 2019, okay? As you can see, the bottle green area are like 80%. So these are like where share of land used for permanent meadows and pastures are high, right? Where is India? So this type of land we use to rear our cattle, okay? So India's share of land used for permanent meadows and pasture is around 5%. So it's not much, okay? So maybe India does not do much more cattle farming, compared to the other countries in the world, okay? Moving on, employment. So if you can recall from your previous lecture where we talked about fisheries in greater detail, you have also come across the employment in fisheries. On the left-hand panel, we are getting number of people employed in fisheries and fish farms for the year 2018. The first row or the first horizontal bar diagram, what is it showing? It's showing world. 38.98 million fishers and 20.53 million fish farmers. This is the total fisher and fish farmers in the entire world, okay? What about Asia? It looks like from this graph, it is actually the world fish farmer and fisher is actually governed or influenced by Asia. Asia is having 30.77 million fishers and 19.62 million fish farmers. So this is for a particular time. Now, the right-hand panel gives you the overtime picture. This you have already come across, so you have some idea. So what does it show? It shows that between 1995 to 2018, number of people employed in fisheries and aquaculture is actually rising. So there are a lot of people who are actually taking up fisheries as an employment opportunity. Now, so we have seen the graphs. So is it like, does it show any importance? Yes, it does. So common pool resources actually it supplements rural livelihood, especially for the developing countries where most of the population reside in rural area. So they may not have proper employment opportunities. So they might have or they might depend upon these common pool resources as their livelihood, okay? And it also works as safety net during agricultural crisis. So agriculture can go into crisis. I mean, it is quite possible. In those times, people might switch to, let's say, fishing, okay? Those who are doing farming in agriculture, I mean, let's say those who have land and doing farming, they might switch to fish farming when there is severe crisis or let's say severe drought, okay? That is also possible. Other than that, there is another important factor which these common pool resources do play. That is it works as a complementary between agricultural output and the agricultural input, okay? What are the agricultural input? So one input is irrigation, okay? So it might happen that irrigation or the sources of irrigation is a common pool resources. I'm sure if you have ever visited to a rural area, you might see there are lot of ponds or lot of canal which is owned by everyone. It is not a private property. So, and it is helping in the irrigation process, right? So the input is going for agriculture and output is agriculture. Let's say that we are producing paddy and you are taking irrigation help from the common pool resources. So in a way, common pool resources are also acting as an input for your agriculture. And lastly, common pool resources are also providers of ecosystem services to rural and urban areas, right? This we have already discussed, that how forest, how soil, these are very important resources for us human being or even non-human being too, to live on this earth, right? To live in a healthy manner. Forest and everything is very, very important. So that's how common pool resources are very important, very significant in economic development, especially for rural areas, for developing countries. It provides an employment opportunity for rural poor people, and there are a lot of studies which have actually shown that actually these common pool resources are sometimes do help to alleviate poverty, which is one of the very important goal for development. Now, at this point, I'm going to ask you to think about India. So we are from India, right? So that's why we need to think how in the development process of India, how common pool resources are playing a significant role. How are you using these common pool resources? Think about it. Or if possible, you can also Google and try to figure out the answer. If you can't figure out, I'm here to help you. Before we get the answer of how India is using its common pool resources, let us just focus on the definition of common pool resources in Indian context. So common pool resources are defined as non-exclusive resources to which the rights of use are distributed among a number of owners. These co-owners are generally identified by their membership of some other groups, such as a village or a tribe or a particular community. Most micro-studies on use and access of common pool resources in India have adopted this working definition of common pool resources. Okay? And what are the examples in case of India? So we have community pastures, forest, village ponds, wasteland, common dumping and threshing grounds, watershed, drainages, etc. Okay, so these are a couple of common pool resources you would find in Indian context. Now, let me give you some graphs. So in this particular lecture, I'm going to focus on common pool resources as land as a common pool resources. Secondly, water, and some kind of fuel wood which we are getting from forest. Okay. So this particular graph shows us the components of common property land resources. As you can see, with this common property land resources, the 23% actually belong to this community pastures and grazing land, whereas 16% belongs to village forest and woodlots. We also have state-wise common pool resources or common pool land resources data. What does it show us? It shows us that it ranges from 1% to 32%. So Rajasthan is the state where the share of common pool resources to total geographical area is around 32%. Whereas we are seeing that Tripura, Punjab, these states, they're having only 1%. It's very less, right? West Bengal is having only 2% of common pool land resources to total geographical area. So there are states like Rajasthan, Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh. They are having more than 20% of common pool land resources. And there are states like Tripura, then West Bengal, they are having very less. Now, this particular table gives us fuel wood from common pool resources. Fuel wood we need is like we are using fuel wood as a source of energy, especially the rural population. So this is a particular data from rural sector, right? Now focus on the extreme left column. It shows the population size class of villages. So there are villages where you don't even have 100 people. So there are less than 100 people, and there are villages where 1001 and above, right? So you can imagine the village where only 100 people are residing, it's a small village, okay? So in those particular village, the first row shows that most of the people or most of the households are using, at least the data is showing us 93% of household reporting this fuel wood, and they are collecting it from common pool resources. So 88% of household of these small villages, they are actually collecting this fuel wood from common pool resources. What does it mean? It means it is very much possible that these villages are maybe nearby in some hill terrain or maybe nearby some forest area. And they're solely depending upon the fuel wood as their source of energy, as opposed to like we use in the urban area, we use gas, right? But they are totally dependent upon this fuel wood, and also they are dependent upon that common pool resources. Maybe they are gathering this fuel wood from maybe some forest which is owned by everyone, okay? Now, this next table, this shows us the value of collection of category of households. By category of households, we are basically meaning this rural household. There are rural households. We call it the rural laborer household, where their income is mostly coming from by doing the laboring work in some others' land. If you can recall at this point of time, the lecture where we discussed about this agricultural ownership, land ownership, then you can obviously will be able to connect back to here. So there are rural labor household who are collecting fuel wood, fodder, etc., and their average value of collection per household is the highest. That is the rupees 777. Okay, looks like rural labor household, they are very much dependent upon this kind of common pool resources. Whereas if you can focus on this land possessed 1 or more hectare, that means this type of household, they are having some amount of land. They are not that much dependent on the common pool resources. Other than that, there are also a lot of studies which have actually talked about that it is actually the poorer section of the rural society who are basically dependent upon these common pool resources for their livelihood, for their sources of energy, etc. Now, it's the time to talk about some water resources. So this particular graph shows us the use of common pool water resources by rural India. What does it tell us? It tells us that 23% of the household in the rural India actually, they are actually using the water for irrigation purpose, and they're drawing it from common pool resources. Similarly, livestock rearing is another place where people are using water from common pool resources. Okay, and there are also fishing and household enterprises. They are, this 3% or 3% for household enterprises who are using for this particular purpose, and they're drawing it from the common pool water resources. This is a summary for the entire India. I would just like you to focus on the first thing, that is called percentage of CPLR in total geographical area. So for the entire India, we have like 15% of total land resources actually belong to this common pool category of the entire geographical location. So it also talks about the per household, CPLR per household, that is very small, 0.31 hectare. Go to the next one, that is collection from common pool resources. So household reporting collection of any material from common pool resources, that is 48%. So looks like it's 48% households are there who have reported to collect anything from this common pool resources. So it shows how rural India is dependent upon the common pool resources. And also it gives the picture of nature of use of common pool resources. Let's say the share of fuel wood in value of collection from common pool resources is around 58%. And average quantity of fuel wood collected from common pool resources is around 500 kg. Okay, so the type, we talked about this fuel wood, where people are collecting fuel wood from common pool resources, and it's looked like the quantity. So what is the average quantity? It's looked like it's the 500 kg. So it's lot actually. So what are the key points? We are almost ending this lecture. So what are the key points? So we started with the concepts non-excludability and rivalness. So we have seen this non-excludability and rivalness, it actually help us to define certain kinds of goods. It help us to categorize goods in various categories. And common pool resources are actually those type of resources which are non-excludable and rival in nature. We have also seen that common pool resources are very important in case of rural local development. Lot of people actually in rural areas, mostly people from very backward background or people, mostly the poor people, they're actually depending upon these common pool resources in terms of their employment and livelihood. Okay, and other than that, common pool resources are very important to maintain the environment and sustainability, right, which we have already discussed in greater detail in the last class. Okay, so water, land resources and fuels, this type of common pool resources, we are actually getting this type of common pool resources in case of India or in Indian context, and we have seen that around 48% of households have reported to collect any material from common pool resources. So it shows that Indians, especially the rural Indians, actually they are quite very much dependent upon this type of common pool resources for their livelihood. So with this, I'm going to end today's lecture. So see you in the next class. Thank you.